right, good morning, everyone from the West Coast. Good early afternoon to those of us joining from the East Coast, and good middle of the night if you happen to be up in Taipei for this event. I am Kharis Templeman. I am a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and the program manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's my distinct pleasure today to moderate a conversation with Wendy Cutler, who is the Vice President and Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Today's topic is U.S. Taiwan economic ties. And I don't think it's too strong a statement to say that they are at a crossroads at this moment. There have been some promising changes in the economic relationship over the last 24 months. In 2020, President Tsai Ing-wen lifted a ban on U.S. pork imports containing the feed additive ractopamine. She removed a longstanding irritant in trade relations with the United States by doing that. And in return, last summer, the Biden administration restarted bilateral talks with their Taiwan counterparts under the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA. And that was those were held for the first time since 2016. In more recent months, the two sides have begun additional discussions about strengthening the resilience of global supply chains, including the supply of Taiwan's most strategically important export, semiconductors. In this discussion, Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society will comment on these developments and the prospects for deepening U.S. Taiwan economic relations in this current geopolitical moment. Before I turn the floor over to her, let me just introduce her. In her roles at the Asia Society Policy Institute, she focuses on building the Institute's presence in Washington, D.C., and on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade, investment, and innovation, as well as women's empowerment in Asia. She joined the Asia Society Policy Institute following an illustrious nearly three-decade career as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative at one point. During her USTR career, she worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations and initiatives, including particularly relevant for today's conversation, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. She's published a series of papers on the Asian trade landscape, and she also serves as a regular media commentator on trade and investment developments in Asia and the world. So I can think of no one better at this particular moment to provide a deep and balanced perspective on U.S.-Taiwan economic relations. And it's a real pleasure to have VP Cutler with us today. Before I turn the floor over to her, I just want to note to our audience that if you would like to raise a question, we will have a lot of time for a moderated Q&A after VP Cutler's formal remarks. Please type your question into the box at the bottom of the Zoom platform. There's a Q&A box. You can just type it in there, and I will do our best to get to your question and to present it to VP Cutler. So without further ado, I will turn the platform over to VP Cutler.
Well, thank you very much, Kharis, for the invitation to speak and your kind introduction. And thanks to the Hoover Institute, it's really my pleasure to be joining you. You know, these days, when there's an event on Taiwan, frankly, it's generally about cross-strait tension. It's about the semiconductor global crisis. It's about, you know, what Xi Jinping's going to do next vis-a-vis Taiwan. Or the latest, it's about how the Ukraine situation affects U.S.-Taiwan relations. Today, we're not going to be discussing those. Maybe Kharis will, but I won't be. I'm not the expert there. I'm a former trade negotiator and, you know, really focuses on the economic side of our relationships with the economies in the Indo-Pacific region. But to be honest, all of these developments are in, they're the backdrop of any discussion of closer economic ties. So I hope in the next 10 minutes or so, just to kind of give some brief comments on where our trade and economic relationship with Taiwan, where it's been, where it's headed, and maybe where it should be headed. First, I would say that we already have very strong trade and investment ties with Taiwan. Taiwan is our 10th largest goods partner of two-way trade, that means. And for Taiwan, we are their second largest trading partner. Taiwan exports to the United States have been growing steadily over the years, up about 58% from 2012 to 2020. And just in the past 11 months of this year compared to the 11 months of last year, Taiwan exports are up 28%. I assume most of those are semiconductors and related electronics products. Tomorrow, our full year data will come out on the US, so we'll have a better sense of the 12 months, but for now we're still at the 11 months. And US exports to Taiwan, they're at a lower level, but they've also been demonstrating a steady increase. And for the first 11 months of this year, up about 21% from the same time period in 2020. Foreign direct investment also is a pretty good story between the United States and Taiwan. Those statistics lag a bit, but in 2020, our stock of US FDI to Taiwan was about $32 billion, up 9% since 2019. And Taiwan's FDI in the United States at about $14 billion in 2020, which was up about 4% from 2029, but I think that number is going to grow significantly given the commitments from TSMC to build at least one fab in Arizona in the coming years. The calls to strengthen and take our trade and economic relations to the next level have been going on for a long time. I mean, since the early days when I worked at USTR, there were different fits and starts about how we should be doing more with Taiwan. For me, as the negotiator for the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, I felt the pressure right after we concluded the Kharis agreement, because I think Taiwan really felt from a competitive point of view that it was going to lose out given the US-Korea FTA. So the push then, I think, was more for straight commercial and economic reasons. But over the years, the push has also been from Congress for political reasons, and frankly, from Taiwan as well. Now, the administration has kind of embraced the strengthening of relations over the years, both Republican and Democratic administrations, but has largely resisted calls to do a comprehensive free trade agreement. Why is that? I would just cite two reasons. One, frankly, we had a lot of trade problems and trade irritants with Taiwan, from intellectual property protection to medical devices to high tariffs, and then to pork and beef and agriculture more widely. There were a lot of flashpoints in our trade relationship, and it was unclear through the years whether Taiwan was really serious in kind of cleaning these up and then agreeing to high standard rules, which would kind of set the rules of the road and really constrain what they could do in these sectors. And the second, frankly, was concern about the reaction from the mainland. And as we were strengthening and trying to strengthen our economic and commercial ties with China, there was a concern that if we went full stream ahead with Taiwan, would our ability to work with China decrease? And, would they then, be relying more on imports from the rest of the world and not the United States? The pork and beef issue in particular, and Kharis, you alluded to that, was always kind of like this, the tense point in the relationship. And here are just two reasons. Like everyone, particularly in the foreign policy world, they look at trade folks and they say, why are you putting so much emphasis on pork and beef? And I think there are really kind of two reasons here. One is that for any free trade agreement to get congressional approval, given our politics, the agriculture community's support is instrumental and frankly critical. And if the agriculture community is against an agreement, it's very hard to get it through Congress. There are many of our senators and congressmen, particularly in the key committees that are in charge of trade, which are very focused on these issues. So that's number one. But number two, being able to move on really sensitive, domestically sensitive issues like pork and beef foods, ractopamine issues were for Taiwan, are really a litmus test of a country, of an economy's political will to really do what's needed, to kind of counter the opposition and show real leadership. And, absent that, you have to ask, if we enter into free trade agreement negotiations where so many more of these decisions are required on every product, is that economy really up to the challenge? And so it did become a litmus test. I give President Tsai incredible kudos for just taking the issue on, facing the domestic opposition in 2020, and then, being able to ensure through her work and her team's work that the referendum that was put forward to the Taiwanese people in 2021 did not pass. And so from my perspective, she's passed the test there. This issue is behind us. It was politically difficult. And I think it does show that, Taiwan is very serious about not only wanting to step up their economic and trade ties with the United States, but even possibly enter into free trade agreement negotiations. And since that time, we've seen a real kind of increase in interest, particularly in Congress, asking the administration, step up economic engagement, consider a free trade agreement, lay the groundwork for FTA negotiations. And if you look through some of the provisions in the bills, the Competes Act, which was just passed by the House, and the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act passed by the Senate, which is going to go to conference soon, has a lot of Taiwan provisions overall on all aspects of the relationship. But in the economic area, a real call for stepping up and laying groundwork for more economic engagement. And so this gets me kind of to the next part of my remarks, and that is, what is the best course for that increase and strengthening and deepening in those economic ties? And here, again, a lot of folks are calling for the initiation of FTA, free trade agreement negotiations between the United States and Taiwan. And from my point of view, I think we need to be really clear-eyed about this prospect. And in that regard, I'm just going to share 5 points that I think we really need to think about carefully, both the United States and Taiwan. Of those 5 considerations, 2 for me, I'll call realities of the current situation, and 3 are challenges. So the 2 realities for me are, number 1, President Biden is not doing trade agreements right now. He has made it clear that he's focusing on the domestic agenda, that there's a view that if we were going to do trade agreements again, they'd have to look very different than previous trade agreements, including a greater emphasis on worker-centric provisions, on incorporating environmental concerns, and really provisions to work for the American middle class. And in that regard, the two active FTA negotiations under the Trump administration, one with the United Kingdom, the other with Kenya, have both been put on hold. And there's really, it appears to be little appetite for, proceeding, although there does seem to be some activity, particularly with respect to the United Kingdom. And maybe in the coming months, we'll see a restart of those negotiations. I'm not sure. On Kenya, it seems to me that we may see some kind of announcement, which was alluded to last week by Deputy USTR Sarah Bianchi, about some kind of path forward with Kenya, maybe short of an FTA. But so number one, I think we just need to keep that in mind. Number two, there is no trade promotion authority now, TPA. And TPA is the legislation that expired a year ago, July, under which Congress basically provides to the administration negotiating objectives. And once those objectives are achieved and serious consultations are held, the Congress would, vote on an agreement without amendments, up or down. That legislation is not in place. Now, it's not impossible to conclude a free trade agreement without trade promotion authority. You just need to secure the majority from each house, from the House and from the Senate. The House, it's easier to bypass TPA because they can set up a rule that looks like TPA. The Senate it's a little more complicated. Now, when I raise this point to my friends, certain friends who are advocating for a Taiwan FTA, they respond and they say, well, look, there's overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress for a Taiwan FTA, so not really a problem. And here, based on my experience, I would just say it's very different to sign a letter as a congressman or a senator urging the administration to enter into free trade agreement negotiations, and then actually vote in favor of the agreement the administration brings home if the concerns of your constituents have not been met. And so I don't equate just signing a letter with that means, let's check the box that senator, supports the agreement. For certain members, it does mean that. But I guess my point is you can't just say 150 members sign that letter, so we have 150 votes. It's a lot more complicated than that. Now, the three challenges I see in proceeding, one is that FTA negotiations are not easy. They're a hard slog. They involve many, many issues. People kind of focus on tariffs, but they include everything from customs to services to labor, the environment, and now, and I'll get to this in a minute, even currency manipulation. And so, they're not easy. And I've seen some foreign policy types when they talk about the prospects of a U.S. Taiwan FTA, they say, oh, this will be an easy negotiation with Taiwan. I can tell you, based on my experience, no FTA negotiation is easy. Now, I'm not saying that's not a reason to do it, but I think there's a reason to be very clear-eyed if you're going to undertake such an initiative. And here, let's just get back to agriculture. While Taiwan's tariffs are pretty low on industrial products, they do have a pretty high tariff rate, I think an average tariff rate of 9% on agricultural products. And it's a very politically sensitive sector for Taiwan. And so I suspect that the agriculture issues would be very difficult. Another challenge is that there are still existing bilateral irritants in the trade relationship. And the way I always measure this is annually, the USTR puts out what's called the National Trade Estimates Report. In the old days, each country or economy would count the number of pages that were devoted to all of their bad behavior items. Taiwan in 2020 or 2021, excuse me, the next one, the next NT will come out in April. But for 2020, 10 pages of Taiwan barriers, right? Everything from tariffs to investment restrictions, medical device approvals, copyright legislation, etc. And I'll be the first to say that Taiwan has made incredible progress and inroads through the years in addressing a lot of the concerns of the United States in all of these areas. But my understanding is it's still kind of a work in progress. And then I would add on the challenge, and I alluded to this before, of currency manipulation. And just in December 2021, the Treasury Department, in its annual, semi-annual, congressionally mandated currency manipulation report, it did watch list Taiwan. Taiwan did apparently meet all the criteria for being labeled a currency manipulator, but Treasury didn't go that far. And the only reason I raise this is because under the USMCA, the new NAFTA, currency manipulation provisions are now kind of a standard feature of US free trade agreements. And so this is kind of another area that could, present some challenges in terms of Taiwan, enthusiastically agreeing to take on, tough provisions. And then finally, the challenge I would highlight, and probably the one that, a lot of, folks who are watching this are probably going to say, why don't you raise this one first? And that is kind of the elephant in the room, and what would the China response be? I will say, I think it's less of a concern now in the US than it was, during the years I was at USTR. But it's still something that any administration needs to take into consideration. If you think China's just going to respond in the trade lane, does that mean they'll withdraw from the phase 1 agreement if we announce, FTA negotiations with Taiwan? Would they stop buying our agricultural products? Would they start harassing US companies? Or would it all just kind of, they just make a lot of noise and just kind of live with this? And some people respond to this and say, well, Taiwan did an FTA with Singapore and New Zealand in 2013, so it'll be the same with the United States. And I would just say our relationship's kind of at a different point than it was in 2013. And my understanding, both with Singapore and New Zealand, they got the green light from China to go ahead before they entered into these negotiations. So, I don't mean to be very negative about the prospects, but I just think it's important that folks are clear-eyed about the challenges and the realities. I don't think it means of U.S. Taiwan FTA negotiations are impossible, but I just think it's complicated. And so when I think of strengthening our economic relations now, particularly given the long time frame an FTA would take also, I'm pretty impressed with what the Biden administration, their approach. And basically, the way I see it right now, they have 3 interministerial, interagency dialogues going on with Taiwan, one by USTR, one by state, and one by commerce. And if you add up these 3, I think that is a pretty robust agenda. Now, just briefly, with respect to the USTR venue, this is not a new one that the Biden administration created. This is the TIFA that Kharis referred to at the beginning. It was created, when I was preparing for this remarks, I couldn't believe it. It started in 1994, so it's almost 30 years old. I led a number of these when I was at USTR. It's kind of gone through fits and starts. And when the United States got angry at Taiwan for not opening up its pork market or not doing something else, not making enough progress, it kind of put these meetings on hold. And during the Trump administration, the TIFA was never held. But last June, the TIFA was held at a very senior level, made very positive announcements coming out of both sides with progress and a number of important issues like medical devices and trade secrets, etc. They also talked a lot about supply chains. And then something that I think is important, particularly when we think about prospects of an FTA, they established a new working group on labor, which was going to focus on combating forced labor in supply chains. And I think this is important because this, in any perspective, FTA with Taiwan or any other economy under this administration, there's going to be a real, again, focus on the worker-centric provisions, labor rights, and forced labor, child labor, slave labor, etc. And so I think if I were in Taiwan's shoes, I think it's a real opportunity for them to show the administration how far they can go in this area, because the administration will want to use whatever FTA they do, or assuming they go forward with an FTA, they'll want to use that agreement as a model to show the world that there's a new template, and that will need to include very strong labor provisions. So that's number one dialogue. Number two, the State Department has a dialogue. Let me see if I can, it's called the EPP, the Economic Prosperity Partnership. This was created during the end of the Trump administration, but the Biden team met towards the end of last year with their Taiwanese counterparts, talking about global health, about 5G, science and technology, supply chains, investment screening, infrastructure, and energy. And that was chaired on the U.S. side at a very senior level, the Undersecretary of State. And then if that wasn't enough, the Commerce Department has gotten into the act. In 2021, they created their own kind of dialogue initiative, the Technology, Trade, and Investment Collaboration Framework, where they will be really focusing on strengthening critical supply chains and commercial ties between, the companies involved in supply chains, as well as promoting foreign direct investment. So with that overview, I'm just going to sum up now, and I'll turn it back to Kharis. I think there is reason to be optimistic here. There is robust economic engagement between the United States and Taiwan. I don't think the USTR state and commerce dialogues are all that's going on between our two economies. We also cooperate in APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And I would note that the United States will be hosting that in 2023 in the United States. So I think there'll be opportunities for more collaboration between the US and Taiwan during our host year. And we're also cooperating in the World Trade Organization, as we both have a number of overlapping common interests, including with respect to negotiations on e-commerce and on an effective pandemic response. So again, the question is this sufficient? Is there an expectation we need to do more? And I would just want to conclude with, just something based on my experience, again, as the lead negotiator for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement negotiations. And that was, Kharis will be celebrating its 10th anniversary of being in effect in this March. But it came into effect in 2012, but the first version was concluded in 2007, and it took 5 years just to get it through Congress. And the only reason I raise this is because Korea was a strong ally, and there was a lot of political will in Seoul to make this agreement happen. And yet those negotiations were some of the most complicated, controversial, and kind of acrimonious talks, and heated, but we came to an agreement at the end, but they were not easy, by any measure. And so it's not just enough to say, we're partners, there's political will. I think, again, if we're going to jump into an FTA, we all need to be kind of clear-eyed and ready for the challenges that will be challenges and realities of the situation. So back to you.
All right. Thank you, Wendy. That was a tour de force. You managed to cram in a lot of material and synthesize it very well on what's a very complicated topic that not a whole lot of people have the expertise that you do on. So thank you for that. All I want to start out with a question about, actually to note that in addition to the pork issue in Taiwan and before that, the beef issue, so these ag issues that have been a longstanding irritant in U.S. Taiwan ties, um, the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan publishes an annual white paper that documents a long list of challenges or problems that they present this to the Tsai administration or whoever's in power and advocate for ways to resolve these issues. And the most recent white paper in 2021 actually noted that the Tsai administration had resolved a record 13 of 92 issues and had made a really good progress on another 23 of those 92 issues. And so, and in fact, the last time I was in Taiwan, I had a meeting at AmCham, and they the messaging out of there was very positive, that the Tsai administration had, it'd taken them a while to get to the addressing some of these issues, but they had made a lot of progress in the last couple of years. So the ractopamine issue seems to be the tip of the iceberg here. So I'm wondering, given the willingness on the Taiwan side to be a good partner in these talks, what do you think the other sticking points are going to be in the now three different agencies in the U.S. government that are talking to their Taiwan counterparts? What are the big issues from your experience that come up every time there's a meeting in these?
You mean like specific trade issue areas?
Yeah, which issue
Yeah.
areas?
So I think just the buckets would be agriculture. And remember, in a free trade agreement, you're really, you not only do you have to get rid of the non-tariff measures and, make sure any measures taken are based on science and not just, to close the market, but also you need to bring down the tariffs and or significantly expand the quotas. And so I don't know enough about the specific products in Taiwan, but like just take the issue of rice, which at least based on my negotiating experience with Japan and Korea were two of the, the most sensitive, the most sensitive product, right? And so, I'm sure you could look and, there's probably a lot of other those types of products where there would be a lot of, concern. Now, in trade negotiations, just because you have tariffs, it doesn't mean on day one when the agreement comes into effect, you have to eliminate all those tariffs, right? You can stage in the elimination. And that's what those negotiations are about, where Taiwan would probably want a very long staging process and the US would want shorter. So that's one area. I think the IPR, intellectual property protection, is just another area. I mean, I hear about like copyrights, that I guess Taiwan has amended its copyright law, but there still are some concerns. A lot of times in any economy, it's not just passing the law or putting the regulation into effect. It's like, how is it being enforced, and is it really working, or are there and so that becomes very kind of important as well. But I did note that the trade secret issue, which used to be very controversial between the United States and Taiwan, seems to have been resolved, or at least USTR highlighted that area as an area of major progress. And then, at least when I work with Taiwan, we are always hearing about medical devices and pharmaceuticals. I can't say I'm up to date there, but that has to do with approvals and transparency, and just, getting less about tariffs, more about kind of the regulatory process and transparency and fairness in the regulatory process.
That's very helpful. Yeah, on the trade secret issue, the most recent AmCham paper actually mentioned that the judiciary in Taiwan had changed their procedures to preserve trade secrets in court hearings, and they had it was a pretty drastic step from what they had been doing before, a significant shift in behavior there. So there's been, I think, some real progress on that issue, as you noted. I want to follow up with another question, actually to shift in a slightly different direction, and to talk a little bit about the TPP and the CPTPP. The comprehensive, I can never remember CPTPP.
Progressive.
The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is the successor to the TPP. It, at this point, does not include the United States, but does include all of the other original members who negotiated the TPP, including Japan, Canada, Mexico, and Australia. And last September, both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan applied, in very close succession to join the CPTPP. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on the possibility that China might actually be admitted. Is this just a symbolic step where they're kind of using this for propaganda value, or is there actually a possibility that, say, Japan and Australia might relent in their opposition to Chinese accession? And then related to that, what are Taiwan's chances if the PRC joins, or if they don't? Does that affect Taiwan's prospects at all?
Well, that could be a subject of an individual webinar, but I'm going to give you kind of the short answer. I mean, my view is the United States, we need to take China's application to join CPTPP very seriously. They've been looking at this for many years. Even when I was involved in the negotiations, it was clear that they were reading the agreement, translating it, trying to understand what it might mean for them. And so, I hear, certain observers say, well, they'll never be able to live up to the state-owned enterprises or digital or labor, so we don't need to take this seriously. It will never happen. And my response is that is not the right way to look at this. I think China is serious. I do think that they want to join, and the distinction I'm also always emphasize is there's kind of the front end and the back end, right? So the front end means when the negotiations start, and in terms of the procedures for the CPTPP, that means the establishment of a working group. And once that working group's established on a country's accession, and the negotiations have actually begun. And so they could, there's no timeline, right? They could take a year. And the UK is the first acceding country. A working group has been established. And I think the prospects are good that by the end of this year, the UK will be done with its accession negotiations. But for a country like China, it could take years and years. But once the negotiations start with a country like China, and given their economic ties and influence over the other CPTPP members, I think they will gradually become almost like a de facto member, even if the negotiation isn't concluded. I think they'll observe more meetings. When the countries sit around and want to update the rules, China might be brought into those conversations. And so I think we need to take it seriously. For the purpose of our discussion today, I'm often asked, like, why did China join, when it joined? And some foreign policy types always like to think, well, we announced AUKUS the day before, and the next day, within 12 hours, China announced it wanted to join CPTPP. My personal view is, and no one knows the real reasons, I think that's coincidence. And what I have, what people are saying, what I have heard, that China was very concerned that Taiwan was, being assertive, kind of talking to all the many of the other CPTPP countries, and they were worried that Taiwan might apply before them. And so they applied, and then 6 days later, Taiwan applied. And now the CPTPP members need to decide what are the next steps. Are we going to establish, a working group for China and Taiwan? Very complicated decisions. A country like Japan has come out and said, we support Taiwan's accession. Other countries have just, kind of said, well, anyone who can live up to the high rules, they should be able to join. But it's a very complicated decision. And on top of it, I understand China's putting pressure on certain CPTPP members not to even consider Taiwan's application. So these are going to be very sticky, controversial, way beyond trade decisions that are going to need to be made by individual governments of the CPTPP countries. There will be some, as you mentioned, like Japan and Australia, who are going to be probably more reluctant to welcome China's participation. But I just think that over time, it's going to be hard for them to, to block the establishment of a working group, particularly given their strong economic ties with China, and frankly, given the absence of the United States, not only in this agreement, but more broadly, in the region, even though that will shortly change with the announcement of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework by the Biden administration.
Great. I want to follow up on that, but first I want to give our senior fellow, Larry Diamond, who's also on the line here, an opportunity to pose a question. Larry?
I have a separate question, but I want to follow up on that too. And good morning, Wendy, and thank you so much for this incredibly lucid and informative presentation. I wanted to ask you what it means for the U.S. To take China's application seriously. Potentially, there are two implications of that. One is that we try and use whatever diplomatic engagement, or to put it crudely, muscle we can to keep China from actually joining the CPTPP. And the second is that we make a renewed bid, which means a domestic political bid, to try and mobilize an American application. So did you have anything in mind in the first basket? And in the second, it just seems now, in the era we're in, the populist era we're in, that something this far-reaching is just absolutely dead in terms of a political mechanism or a political pathway for the U.S. to ultimately apply for membership with the necessary congressional support. So in answer to the second half of this, do you see any prospect on the horizon politically that the case could be made for the U.S. seeking to join TPP and putting it to the Congress? And, who's making that case and how would it be made?
Well, those are great questions, Larry, and good to see you. We're not a member of the CPTPP. So in terms of your first question, when I say take it seriously, I don't mean like we should be out there saying we oppose Chinese membership. I think China would turn around and say, who cares what you think? If you want, if you want to offer your opinion, why don't you bid? I could just, I think it would be like a really downward spiral, back and forth, unneeded. I mean, privately, I'm sure there are discussions going on between, the leaders, the foreign ministers, the trade ministers of the CPTPP countries sharing with the United States what's going on. And, the US, I think, privately can express its views. But again, we're not members. Like, we lost our right to kind of influence or block this process. I'm sure a number of the countries now probably really miss us because these are really tough political decisions for them to take. With respect to your second question on rejoining CPTPP, I mean, I'll just go back, to what I said before, that Biden's been pretty clear. He doesn't want to do trade agreements. But interestingly enough, unlike Trump, he hasn't taken CPTPP totally off the table. In fact, what he said, if you really read his comments, are more that CPTPP is outdated. It doesn't reflect the realities of, of the current situation domestically, internationally, et cetera. So in my humble view, if we were ever going to rejoin, and I realize this is a stretch and the politics aren't there, we would need to seek revisions. And I don't just mean updating the digital trade chapter, to reflect technological developments. I mean, looking at what worked for the United States and securing bipartisan approval of the USMCA when that was brought to Congress under the Trump administration, And are some of those provisions, like I mentioned, currency manipulation or stricter rules of origin on autos, are any of those provisions, should we look at them and maybe add them? And then are there certain aspects of CPTPP, certain provisions that frankly, we're no longer interested in. And here, this investor state dispute settlement mechanism is one that, Republicans, basically told Obama if ISDS wasn't in that agreement, they'd never vote for it. Well, they voted for the USMCA without it. So, things are changing. So I think if you could maybe shape this agreement more as, one that addresses the concerns of this, workers, middle class and citizens, and somehow advocate those changes, which could also work for the CPTPP countries, there could be a way forward. Let's be honest, I think the geostrategic elements or rationale or reasons for joining will become, greater as China gets more serious. But when, my view is, having worked on not only negotiating trade agreements, but getting them through Congress, the geostrategic arguments are helpful, but they generally don't take that agreement over the finish line unless the economic provisions are tight and reflect, what the senators and congressmen want.
Great. Thanks for that, Wendy. I want to follow up on a point you raised earlier, which is the Biden administration is planning to unveil an Indo-Pacific economic framework over the within the next month, it sounds like. Do you have a sense of what that will look like in practice? And are there areas where Taiwan is well placed to play an important role in that framework, along with and strengthen economic cooperation with the U.S., but also other partners and allies in the region?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this Indo-Pacific economic framework is an initiative that the Biden administration now is busily finalizing the details for, and should be unveiled in the region in the coming weeks or month or so. And again, I think it's critical because the Biden administration has realized that if we're going to be, quote unquote, back in Asia, we're going to need an economic agenda as well. That's what Indo-Pacific countries care about. That's what they're interested in. And while they like the security and political ties, the relationship is incomplete without a strong economic component. But given our politics, we can't offer them trade, right? So we can't offer to go back in the CPTPP. And many countries in the Indo-Pacific, that's exactly what they would prefer. So what the administration is trying to do is kind of everything but trade liberalization. So can we put together an initiative that includes trade facilitation, includes, digital provisions, supply chain resiliency, an environmental component, export controls, investment, bring this all together in an initiative. And if we package it correctly, this could really be impactful for the region. And, that's what, they should be unveiling. Some of our partners they want us back and they want us to have an economic agenda in the region. So they're being positive. But to be real honest, there is some skepticism that we're not, if we can't do trade and we can't offer market access, additional access to the US market, then many of these countries may look at this initiative and think, what's in it for me? When I negotiated the TPP agreement, for example, Vietnam agreed to very strong rules on IPR and on labor, but they didn't do that in a vacuum. They did it because in return, they were getting access to our apparel and footwear market in the form of lower tariffs. So that was worth something to them, and they were willing then to move on the labor provisions. But if you don't have those tariff cuts, the onus will be on the administration to convince these countries there's enough in this initiative for them. So, we'll have to see how it unfolds. And, based on conversations I'm having with the administration, I'm pretty encouraged. I think they're taking this really seriously. They're putting their minds to it. And, they've heard what the other countries are saying. Now, the other big question, and this gets to the Taiwan question, is who's going to join this initiative, and what will be the the rules for joining. And this still is being worked out, but it looks like there will be some kind of option for countries and economies to kind of opt in certain areas and not in other areas. And so it's conceivable that, like on supply chain work, Taiwan could participate. But I can tell you the politics of that, the global politics of that, particularly for some of our trading partners, is going to be very difficult. And they'll probably get a lot of pressure not to join if Taiwan is a part of any of these, what they're called modules or baskets of this Indo-Pacific economic framework. So I think this is one of the topics that the administration probably is working through now. Who do we invite? Under what conditions are they invited? And how do we deal, frankly, with the Taiwan situation? Even if we want them in, does that mean then we may lose, 3 countries in Southeast Asia from joining, for example? I don't know the answer there, but I think one thing I would say is a lot of these agenda items for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework are the same issues that are being addressed in those dialogues I mentioned earlier, the dialogues with state, the dialogue with commerce on supply chains, and in the TIFA as well. And so even if Taiwan were not formally a member of the IPEF, that's what we're calling it shorthand, or certain baskets, you could see a situation where we would do kind of parallel work with them in all of these areas. But again, I think the administration is going to really need to think through how they deal with Taiwan, in the broader context of this initiative.
Okay. Are you worried that the administration is basically making the so-called spaghetti bowl of overlapping and contradictory agreements around the region just worse by proposing yet another new framework? Or is that, do you think there's actually some real value added here?
So I think there's value added as long as, and what I've been advocating, like it's all centralized in one spot in the administration.
Okay.
If there are different agencies running at different speeds, doing different initiatives, then you lose the impact of it, frankly, but you also confuse our trading partners and you kind of weaken the outcome. And so, Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tsai appear to be the 2 co-chairs of this new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that hasn't been announced. Secretary Raimondo has really become more of the kind of the public face for this. But my understanding is USTR will be in charge of like the trade work. But for me, I think what's really important is even if there are different agencies working on different pieces, that they all fall under someone who's like in charge of the whole initiative. Or else I think there is a danger, not only that there's like a spaghetti bowl, but also that this initiative doesn't have the oomph and the power and the ability to look like a credible alternative to China's application to join CPTPP.
Okay, I do want to turn to some questions from the audience as well here, and I'll try to combine a couple of these in one. We have a question about, well, just generally the role that the semiconductor industry plays in U.S. Taiwan economic relations, and it's quite striking how important TSMC has become to the U.S. economy as well as to the Chinese economy, and so. Wonder if, in the context of this discussion, if you could talk a little bit about TSMC's role in these negotiations, whether it actually has a voice at the table in some of these dialogues, and to what extent concern about semiconductor supply chains is actually driving the conversation between the 2 capitals.
I think it's obviously an urgent issue. We are very dependent on TSMC, and there's just been an overall kind of awareness in the United States how vulnerable we are with respect to a lot of different supply chains. And so the supply chain work that really Commerce is leading in the semiconductor sector has been, very high profile. TSMC has, been participating in a number of these sessions with Secretary Raimondo and others. Obviously, the U.S. is very happy about TSMC's decision to, build at least one fab in the United States, if not more. But this is kind of a critical area where we really need to work together very closely with Taiwan. And frankly, I think it has kind of worked to Taiwan's advantage because I think many more people in the United States now understand how critical and important a strong economic bilateral relationship between the US and Taiwan is.
Okay, great. So I want to ask if you could clarify for the audience as well, the RCEP, the Regional Economic Cooperation
Regional Comprehensive
Economic Partnership. Yes, thank you.
So alphabet soup in this
yes,
world.
And I admit to being a novice in this area. So RCEP versus CPTPP, is there a significant difference? China's in one, it's not in the other. In Taiwan, this often gets thrown about as if you want to criticize the Tsai administration, you'll criticize them for not participating in RCEP or not finding a way to make nice with China so you can get in and Taiwan is losing out. Other people will defend the Tsai administration and say CPTPP is really where it's at. That's where Taiwan's economic future lies. What is your own view on the difference? And is it important that Taiwan is really dependent on Chinese approval to get into RCEP? Is that a big concern?
So, I mean, in short, RCEP is way weaker than CPT, both with respect to the coverage of the rules. For example, RCEP does not include chapters on labor, environment, or state-owned enterprises. Also, with respect to the depth of commitments, if you look at the IPR chapter, for example, in CPTPP, it's probably twice the amount of pages than the RCEP IPR chapter. And also with respect to the exceptions and long transition periods that countries are granted, the ones that could negotiate or could show that given their development level, they couldn't accept all these obligations from the get-go. Also, many of the RCEP provisions are not subject to dispute settlement. So, if you can't get sued, then you could argue that, implementation becomes more aspirational than critical. And the market access commitments, like the tariff commitments, are a lot weaker. There are exceptions for sensitive products in RCEP and much longer staging periods. But even all of that, I still believe that RCEP is an important regional agreement. It sets up common rules among 15 countries in the Asia Pacific. They have a common rule of origin. They're going to have common customs documentation. And I think this will lead to further integration between these countries of supply chains of their economies. And I think it will just over time become a group of countries that will get together periodically, because the agreement calls for lots of meetings, not only on implementation of existing rules, but they'll talk about setting new rules, right? So we're not at the table for that. I mean, Taiwan isn't either. And so, again, it's easy to say it's a weak agreement. It's not really going to change anything. I think we need to watch this seriously. And again, and Larry's going to ask me, what do you mean by take it seriously? But I'm going to say we need to take that agreement seriously. We shouldn't just kind of say, oh, weak agreement, won't matter, whatever. I'm not really aware of the history of whether Taiwan, the RCEP negotiations began in 2012. And didn't end until last year when the agreement was signed, a year and a half ago when the agreement was signed. I'm not aware whether Taiwan and, tried to get in at that point in 2012. I just don't know the history there. But clearly, in the last years, they were, China was not going to let them in.
Yeah.
And, they have if you're in, Taiwan has a problem. They're not in CPTPP. They're not in RCEP. They are in APEC. They are in the WTO. But I think they're losing out as they watch all their neighbors kind of, establish these kind of regional ties, which I think will encourage more trade and investment between those partner countries of both agreements.
Yeah. So we did an event on this in 2013 and looked at both RCEP and the TPP and Taiwan's potential role in the two. And the overwhelming answer from our Taiwan participants was that China would veto any Taiwanese negotiations to enter RCEP because they were the big player in RCEP. And this was during the Ma administration too, so a much more China-friendly administration in Taiwan. And even under those circumstances, the requirement from Beijing was that Taiwan needed to enter into political negotiations before RCEP was even on the table. And so, to my mind, RCEP is just a complete non-starter for Taiwan.
I mean, that was my take, but then I'm also thinking, 2013, the FTAs with Singapore and New Zealand were concluded. So maybe there was more of an opening then, but yeah. So,
we are just about at time, so I want to use the last minute here just to thank our guest. Just to remind our audience, you have been listening to the speaker series of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region at the Hoover Institution. I'm Kharis Templeman. I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I've been speaking with Wendy Cutler, who is the vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the managing director of their Washington, D.C. office. And we have been really fortunate to have this informative conversation today. I want to thank Wendy for joining us and wish all of you a great rest of your day and week, wherever you may be. Thanks a lot, and we'll sign off here.
Thank you, Wendy.
Bye.